Sometimes we have employees that we may be reluctant to add to our teams because we're worried they're going to be more cost than the benefit they bring. So how do we decide if this is a real fear or if there is nothing behind this? Each employee we add to the team is going to add some cost. Not just their salary, but also extra management time, and they add additional complexity to the communication channels. When we add someone, their cost curve looks something like this. At first, they're very expensive. They require training, they require introduction to our culture, but over time, that cost was going to go down, but it never quite reaches zero because every single person adds cost to a team because of extra complexity, because of additional salary, because having more people on your team does make things more complicated. But of course, each person also brings benefit. Their benefit is going to look more like this. At first, they don't really know how to do things on your team. They're not adding a lot of additional benefit. As they get their feet under them, as they learn how your project works, as they improve their own skills, the benefit they add is also going to increase. But similarly, this is also going to approach some sort of maxima. They will continue to gain experience, but that growth is going to be a lot faster early on than it will be later. With most employees, you are going to reach a crossover point where their day-to-day cost is less than the day-to-day benefit they are bringing. So for every day from that point forward, they are bringing more to the project than they're costing you. Now, you haven't paid for that employee yet. Really, the way to compare these two curves is to look at the area under the two curves. When the area under the green curve is greater than the area under the red curve, then this person is bringing a net benefit to your team. And when we're talking costs here, when we're talking benefit here, we're not just talking about dollars. We're not just talking about things added to the game. There's also cultural costs. There's also cultural benefit. There's also added creativity or added quality to your game that might come beyond simple checklists of tasks. So do a little bit of simple calculus on your two curves and no problem. Then you can figure out if this person is worth having on your team. Of course, that's very glib. It's not as simple as all of that. You don't have those two curves in mathematical purity, and you are going to do a lot of feeling your way through this process. So let's go through a couple of potentially problematic employees and see how we decide if it's worth adding them to your team. First up is the junior employee. This is someone without a lot of experience in the industry who is still learning how to be a game dev. They are going to take longer to train, so they are going to have a higher cost for a longer period of time. And the benefit they're bringing to your team is going to be diminished because they simply don't know how to do as much. But the other thing that you're going to get from juniors is a much more steady growth of what they're capable of doing. They're still learning lots of things. They're still getting better at their tasks. They're still increasing what they're capable of doing. And potentially with juniors, because they're not carrying baggage from previous jobs, from previous experiences, from potentially previous trauma that they have suffered, that upper plateau can, in a lot of cases, actually be higher than what you're going to get from a more senior employee who's carrying more baggage, who's carrying more of a sense of the way things should be done. I'm strongly on the side of juniors. I'm on record several times of saying you should add more juniors to your team. Are there cases when you shouldn't add a junior? And there are, because juniors do require more upfront cost, because what they're adding to your project isn't as beneficial as early in the project. If you don't have very much time left in your project, then adding juniors can actually be a mistake. If you're in the early days and your team is of reasonable size and you've got tons of runway, you're not coming out for a year or 2 or 3, adding juniors is great because they have tons of opportunity to learn how to do the job, tons of opportunity to become full-fledged members of the team and add and own and become greater employees. If you're going into certification in a month and you need this game to be done, now's probably not the time to add a junior. But in most cases, if you've got more than 6 months, Adding juniors is usually beneficial to your project, in my experience, assuming you're adding anyone at all. Small teams that consist almost entirely of very senior people can be highly resistant to bringing on junior people. Not because they don't actually see the benefit after the junior person comes on, but because they can become settled. They are used to having a lot of shorthand with the other senior members of their team. Their communication channels are highly optimized, and they have let their training skills atrophy to a certain degree. So the thought of bringing on juniors is threatening to some degree. And as a result, in their mind and out loud, they are overestimating the amount of training people are going to require. They're underestimating the amount of benefit that they are going to see from these people. And then usually in 99% of cases, once that person comes on, they realize that actually, no, this person's going to ramp up super fast. They don't require as much hand-holding as they worried about, and they're very happy to see the person on the team. But be prepared, with very small teams of very senior people, they can become very insular. They can perform a lot of gatekeeping just because of what they're used to. Almost the flip side is what I'm going to call the hopper. These are people with more experience, but when you are looking at their resume, what you see is that they've had a lot of jobs. They've moved from studio to studio, from project to project, and they haven't stayed anywhere for very long. So how do you decide if you want a hopper on your team? Well, if you just need someone for 6 months, a hopper might be exactly what you want. You want someone who's going to ramp up super fast, who's going to be super engaged in what you're doing for a relatively short period of time, and then is going to want to move on. So when you reach the end of your project and they're starting to get tired of it, great, you part ways and you both win because you got what you needed and they got what they wanted, and everything is in a great shape. In the earlier stages of a project, a hopper can still be beneficial, but the danger can come in not acknowledging what they're likely to do. If you have someone who is likely to leave and you have them build content for your project, or you have them build systems in conjunction with other people, that can work great because when they are leaving, there are other people to take over that content, take over those systems. But if, on the other hand, you treat them as if they're going to be here forever and they are the sole owner of a system, then you could find yourself in a really difficult place. If you have them build your procedural conversation system, and then one day they up and quit, and you have no one else who knows how this conversation system works, and it's only 75% done, now you find yourself in a really difficult place because you don't have a system you can use to ship your game, you don't have an owner for this system, and now you're left in a really tough place. Do you rip it all out and start over again? If you do, then the hopper not only didn't add any benefit to your project, they actually added a ton of cost because you are left having to undo what they've already done in order to move forward. If you have someone that you know is likely to leave the project, has a track record of moving from project to project, they can be a great benefit to you, but you need to acknowledge what they actually are, what they are likely to do, and make sure that you're not left holding the bag if they do suddenly decide to leave. One of the tougher ones to talk about, what about toxic contributors? These are people who have toxic behaviors. So they are either abusive to other employees, they are actively violating corporate policies, but they aren't quite at the point of actually just getting fired. Is there ever a reason to have a toxic person on your project? My opening desire is to say, no, there is never ever a reason to have a person like this on your project. And for the most part, I think that's true. So what you're going to see with someone who is toxic is at first it's going to look like any other person you're adding to the project. Their cost is going to go down, their benefit is going to go up, but then relatively quickly, you're going to see that cost start to turn as you're having to deal with their behaviors. You're having to deal with the impact they're having on other people. You have to having to deal with the morale impact of having someone like this on your project. And then at some point, you're going to cross the point where they are actually costing you more incrementally, day to day, minute to minute, than they're bringing to the project. So given that they're only a benefit in this sort of teardrop shaped space between these two crossover points, is there ever a reason why it's beneficial to have a toxic person on your project? Well, of course, it's never beneficial to have toxic people on your project, but there might be, in extreme cases, reasons why this might be the best thing for your project. If this person is doing work that you can't get done in any other way, they have a hyper specialized skill set, or the timeline is just simply non-negotiable, then this little teardrop shape of benefit might be worth the long-term impact to your project, to your studio. One of the things to keep in mind with people who are toxic is that cost curve isn't going to disappear simply because you end up firing them. You're going to have to deal with the splash damage of having them on the project. So when you're thinking about whether it's worth it, think really long and hard. That being said, there might be cases when this is the only possible answer. Now, can I think of any examples of this? Only toy examples. But if you have someone who has a specialized skill that you cannot cover in any other way, it might be worth keeping them locked up in a closet with a mask on, wheeling them out like Hannibal Lecter to do their specialized work, recognize that they're going to do the damage that they're going to do, potentially assign a person whose entire job is to be ablative armor between them and the rest of the team, and then wheel them back into the closet after you've gotten the benefit you need out of them. But most of the time, no. Most of the time, that toxic person is going to not be worth it. I guess maybe what I'm doing here is trying to come up with an example simply to show how extreme of a situation it should need to be to accept someone toxic onto your team. If I just say don't allow toxic people on your team, then I think people are going to dismiss that and excuse that person on their team. But if I say instead that there might be extreme examples where a very specialized skill set, a very close deadline, a very extreme circumstance makes that person necessary, I think it hits a little bit harder. But yes, if at all possible, do not allow these kinds of people onto your team. Almost the polar opposite is the disengaged person. This person has quiet quit, or they have quit but stayed. They aren't really interested in continuing to do the job, but they're not looking for anything else. They're just going through the motions and they're getting some work done every day. They're doing what is expected of them. These kinds of people, at first glance, can seem to be not so bad because their benefit is greater than their costs. They typically have incredibly low costs because they kind of don't want to be paid attention to at all. They're not really complainers so much as they're hiding in the background, going through the motions, getting the job done on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes that's exactly right, is these people can be your most predictable employees. They don't overcommit because they don't want to be caught not delivering. They tend to undercommit. They tend to do what they're expected of, just barely meeting their expectations on a day-to-day basis, on a week-to-week basis, on a milestone-to-milestone basis. But the thing to keep in mind with very disengaged people is that other employees notice. So what you can find is that what you get is actually this secondary cost, because now you're having to deal with employees who are upset because they're working really hard, they're putting in extra effort, they're pulling out all the stops, and this other guy is just coasting through their day. And that can have multiple different impacts. It can make them disgruntled, which can reduce their velocity. So you have this potential for a cost that you may not be considering as this disengaged person drags the rest of the team back. They act as friction on the work of the rest of the team. Now, if you take that into account, if they are either isolated from other people or they are well liked by the team and the team is happy with the amount of work they are providing, then yes, this kind of person can actually be a net benefit to your team because, as I said, they can be highly predictable. While what they're adding to the team might not be amazing, while they may be providing a lot of B work, often A and A plus games are held together by a lot of B and B minus work, with the A and A plus work being moments of brilliance scattered amongst a lot of essentially glue. The disengaged people who are trying to avoid overworking themselves, who are trying to avoid overcommitting, can be exactly what you want to provide that filler, to provide the stuff that holds things together. But do keep in mind that if they're barely coasting by, the rest of the team is potentially going to notice and they're not going to like that. So you need to keep that in mind when you're considering whether this person is worth it or not. The incompetent person is one that makes me sad. So this is someone who at first seems like the junior. They come in, they don't know how to do anything. You're trying to teach them, but they keep hitting these plateaus. You teach them something and they kind of get stuck there. And then when you put in a bunch of extra additional effort, you're able to maybe move them up a little bit. Maybe they backslide and they slide back to a different plateau that they were at before. And you keep trying to push them up. They're not getting very high and they hit a plateau of skill relatively early and you can't get them any higher than that. It can be hard to know if what you have is someone who has hit their skill plateau at too low of a level to be worth the effort, or if there's just a breakthrough around the corner. But at some point, if a person has been at a skill plateau for a long time, and that skill plateau is less than the amount of support that they are requiring, you're going to have to make a call and say this person isn't going to be able to be a fit and we can't continue this relationship. All of these discussions are assuming that they got through your interview process. Either they are a person that's going to come onto your team from another team, or they went through the interview process and they seem like they're going to be a cultural fit. They seem like they're going to be capable of doing the job. Any one of these people, whether they be toxic or incompetent or even disengaged, can make it through the interview process. People put on their best face when they are trying to get the job, and as a result, sometimes people are going to sneak through. There are two different circumstances when you are going to be having this discussion with yourself. The first is you've interviewed someone, they made it through the process, and now they are revealing themselves to be someone you didn't realize. So you hired them and it turns out, oh no, they're toxic. We didn't catch that in the interview process. It turns out they're toxic. Or I thought they were going to be able to do this job. I thought we were hiring them as a junior. It turns out that actually we're hitting their skill plateau much earlier than we expected. Or they interviewed and they seemed really excited, engaged, but it turns out that they're just looking to check the checkboxes. They are just disengaged from the get-go. In those cases, you are halfway through the curve. So don't fall for the sunk cost fallacy because you've already paid whatever cost you've already paid. So you can make your decision on a go-forward basis because even though they might have been really expensive up till now, you can look forward from here and decide if they're worth keeping on the project. For some of these people, like the toxic employee, that actually makes the decision easier because you've actually gotten most of the positive part already. The rest of it's all negative, so great. Pull the trigger and get it over with. For others, it can actually make the decision more difficult, because if you've been working with that person who's hitting their skill plateau and you're feeling like they're right at the edge, you might be tempted to think that maybe there's another plateau just around the corner. Maybe we can push forward. And maybe there is. Similarly, with someone like a junior employee, if we're halfway through and we've seen what they're capable of, they're probably already bringing more benefit than they're costing. So great. It's only going to get better from here. So keep on going. So the other case is when you know about this person before you add them to your team. They already work for the studio, but they're coming to your team from another team, and you're trying to decide whether or not it's going to be worth going through this curve. Is it worth bringing that junior person on when you're only 2 months away from shipping? Is it worth bringing that toxic person on, pulling them out of cold storage to final the disk layout because they're the only person that knows how to do it efficiently? Is that disengaged person who's been coasting for the last 2 years worth adding to your project for the last year just to get a little bit of additional work? In a lot of cases, the answer to that question is actually going to be yes under certain circumstances. In some cases, like juniors, I would argue that the answer is almost always yes, unless you're in the extreme situation of having a very limited amount of time. On the flip side, for someone toxic, the answer is almost always no, except in very extreme circumstances, potentially non-existent circumstances that I'm artificially manufacturing, because their cost, their long-term damage to the team is not worth the small amount of specialized knowledge that they are going to bring to the table. But like I said, I believe there may be circumstances under which even such an employee might be worth it. This obviously isn't the only exercise that you should be doing when you are adding people to your team. This isn't all a math exercise. And like I said up front, every single person you add to your team adds cost beyond just their salary. They add complexity to your processes. They bring a structural complexity. And at certain points, that structural complexity might cause your team structure to cease to function. So there are other thoughts that should be going through your mind as you are adding people to your team. And of course, we're all people, and these are people as well. And your team is made of people. So things like skills and cultural fit and enthusiasm, these are all things that should be taken into account. I've boiled this all away, abstracted this all away into a couple of artificially smooth curves. And you're not going to be able to build such a curve for a person. You are going to be kind of guessing as to what you're going to get based upon your interactions with them, based upon the reputation they have within your existing organization. So it's much more complicated than simply doing a bit of calculus on two curves to decide if the green curve is bigger than the red curve. But hopefully this provides some structure for you to think about these different kinds of people and why a lot of them who seem like they're going to be expensive ultimately are net benefits to your team, while others who might seem like they're worth it in the short term are going to cost you and potentially cost you big in the long term. If you made it this far, might I suggest thinking about subscribing to the channel? We do talk about a lot of different topics in game dev. A lot of the channel is focused on structure and management and leadership, and it can be applicable beyond the edges of the video game development industry. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there will be a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you are more comfortable with that. If you're interested in supporting the channel in another way, we have merch. This is the High Tea on the High Seas hoodie, and also I'm wearing File It All and Let Triage Sort It Out. There will be tags to that in the video as well. What do you think? Am I reaching too far to try to say there may be cases that you might want to put a toxic person on your team? I'm certainly feeling that it might be a bit too much of a reach. What are some other problematic people that I missed that we should talk about down in the comments? What are some ways that you've decided that someone wasn't worth having on the team, or decided that you wish they were on the team? Let's talk about that down in the comments as well. I will see you again soon. Thank you.